Some of you maybe have purchased this new book by Stuart Murray, The Naked Anabaptist. If you've read Stuart Murray over the last few years, there's not that much that is new here. But it's a helpful book to help us think about this what he calls a post-Christendom context. And he does a very good job, fine job of identifying what some of those transitions are. And he makes a good case as to why it's very important for us to understand these transitions if we're going to do faithful mission in our context. So there are a number of transitions that he lists here, and I'd like to just recap them a little bit. The church used to be at the center. It's now finding itself increasingly on the margins of our society. The Christian story used to be central. And many of us, I still remember in our public school, the Anglican priest coming to pray and bless our school year at the start in September. We had religious studies classes in grade 4 in a public school, a leftover of what Ontario used to be. We've shifted from being a majority in our context to being a minority. The overwhelming majority of Canadians today are not active church-going Christians, right? We have moved from being settlers to sojourners. Settlers, in other words, people who felt at home in this cultural context, a context that was shaped by their story. They were parishioners. But in a post-Christendom context, we're no longer feeling quite as much at home. And we're more like sojourners. We're more like resident aliens, as 1 Peter 1:1 puts it. Pilgrims, exiles. There's a transition from privilege to plurality. Today the church is one community among many in a pluralist society, and we don't have special privileges. There are still some. This shift does not happen overnight, but the trend is clear. A shift from control to witnessing. Earlier, the churches could exert significant control over our society, and the shift now is, we can have influence, but that's not through power. It's simply through witnessing to our story. And there's a shift from maintenance to mission. In other words, doing church, being church in a maintenance mode is, giving the kind of leadership to deal with insider needs. Maintaining, yes, the status quo. Assuming that things will just continue to go on the way they have always been going on. A mission mode is something different. And I'll say a few more things about that as we go on. Now, all of this can come across as a crisis for the church, and many are seeing it that way. There are others who are embracing this, and certainly there would be many Mennonites who would say, well, those stats aren't actually all that scary, insofar as we sort of, with adult baptism, we assume that people just aren't born Christian. They're not just simply parishioners. They have to come to their own faith decision. And we even trust that we don't baptize our infants. We trust that God will be good and that some of our children will indeed embrace the faith, but knowing also that others won't. And we live with that reality. So, is it a crisis? Again, some of us might say we really can be much more faithful and prophetic from the margins. If you're too close to power, you're typically, what you're saying is undergirding the status quo. You're not challenging the system because you're at the center. But if you're at the margins, you're much freer to speak up for the poor. You're much freer to take more radical stands because you have nothing to lose, right? A sojourner rather than a settler. Well, there's lots of good biblical, there are wonderful biblical resources about being in exile, Israel in exile, and what they experience about God in exile, that he's not just limited to the temple in Jerusalem. And Paul's language is often exilic language. We're sojourners. We're not settlers. And for some of us, I think we feel that deep in our bones. Some of you are from the St. Catherine's Church here, and we've got a similar story where, what's home? Is Canada home? Is Paraguay home? Is Russia home? Is Switzerland home? No, I'm a sojourner. I'm traveling lightly on this earth. So that's not necessarily a crisis. But it's our reality. And the upshot of all of this does suggest that in Canada we're at a hinge moment. And the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada just had a conference using that term, hinge. We're at a hinge moment in our history as a country. And the churches better recognize that, or the trends suggest the same fate that the European churches are facing will be our fate as well. And so then again the question comes back to formation in our practices. What are we doing? What are our practices to shape a faithful church for this context into which God has placed us? I don't feel too depressed about this context. I find it very interesting. It's a very exciting time to do church. It will require a lot of creative, theological thinking, but it's exciting. And we've got room to legitimately experiment and do something different, and look for new resources, even as we identify and cherish those resources that our tradition has nourished over generations. And as I mentioned before, others are looking to Anabaptists as well, because we have that longer history of rejecting Christendom in the 16th century, of beginning with the assumption that our context is a mission context, that people have to come to faith, which is the issue behind adult baptism. Stuart Murray, he's not Mennonite, and he's British, and he knows the British situation very well, but what's happening there with the churches. And he's very clear that there's 3 larger denominations in England that are on the verge of extinction. And he uses that word extinction. Very, very close. And some of you who have been in Europe, you know that. You walk down the road and there's a church. Well, it looks like a church, but actually it's a pub. Amsterdam, we went into this wonderful church building that was a cafe. And there's wonderful places to sit around and enjoy coffee and a nice pastry, right? And so Murray is on top of what's happening in Europe. He's quite convinced, as most of us are, that Canada is different than the US, and that we're actually, in terms of these trends, closer to the British reality than the American reality. And he writes, as the Christendom system disintegrates, many Christians in Western societies today are learning from the Anabaptist tradition how to be followers of Jesus in a world we no longer control or dominate. And he notes, just so we're not too smug, he notes that there are other important theological and spiritual resources. But Anabaptism is one important resource with a distinctive contribution to make and whose impact is growing, end of quote. So that's flattering. It's actually also humbling. And he's right in a sense. We have understood ourselves as an alternative community, an alternative or contrast to the society in which we live. And we've been trying to shape ourselves and our children to adopt that kind of alternative mentality, that we are in some way different. Right? And we all have our stories about how that happened, and we'll be sharing some of those in a few minutes. But we know that we have long succumbed to many parts of the Christendom mindset. And we've accepted many of its biases and accepted many of the compromises and commitments that go with it. So, our understanding of church has very often been church as an institution, where we've seen church going as the central event, typically to a special building, typically to an event organized and crafted by special people with MDivs. And where those of us who aren't preaching on Sunday, easily can sit back and take on that spectator role and expect the one at the front to serve us with some kind of religious goods and services, whether that be the bread and wine, whether that be good counseling, whether that be good teaching, good preaching, a good worship band, a good this or good that, right? We want to be tanked up. It's part of the Christendom mindset. It's part of that institutional mindset where leadership, and here it comes back to the role that many of you are in, where leadership's prime role is defined in terms of supporting or nourishing the laity. So it's hierarchical, leadership on top, the masses below, and the role is to yes, feed the sheep, of course, but that becomes the primary and almost exclusive role. Because in that model, the model assumes that the church is not in a missionary context. The model assumes a Christendom context. There's no need for that church to be a movement, right? It's the parishioner model. Now, all of this isn't new, and I'm not claiming that any of this is new. What I am saying is that these changes are so profound, it'll at least take all of our generation to get our heads around it. Especially if we buy into this notion that we're moving from Christendom to post-Christendom. The Christendom model has been with us since the 4th century. And we've almost lost all knowledge of what to be church or how to be church in a context that is not Christendom, even if we've reacted against it. Some of the most interesting church history work, I find, is being done by people like Alan Kreider, who's looking at the first 300 years of church history, so pre-Christendom. And he's suggesting, for our context, we can learn a lot about how they did church, because they too were in a minority, marginal context. When preparing, I had to think back to a ministers' conference in 1997 in Winnipeg. Some of you might have been there. Most of you probably not. It was John Taves, our Grable president at the time, who gave the presentation. And he did an excellent analysis of our current situation. Some similar things to what I've been saying. He also used the term postmodern and what that shift means, and emphasized that our culture is undergoing profound changes. And he didn't mince words. And I want to just quote a few of these, because afterwards I did ask him for the text back then. He says the situation is so new that it requires nothing less than to reinvent the gospel. People no longer understand the message of the forgiveness of sin. They know meaninglessness and they know anxiety, but not the gospel that we have preached. And then we have to completely reinvent church. The Christendom church stands in the way of faith. Churches need to become places of meaningful human interaction. And then he said, we need to reinvent evangelism. It's the first time since the 3rd century AD that the church has been in a real missionary situation. Again, something we've said here today too. And the church will only survive if it learns to become missional. And as it is, people see nothing in the church to which they need to be converted to. Our churches have conformed themselves so much to our culture that people entering them don't need to convert, because it's so similar to the reality in which they used to live, he said. And moreover, we will need to reinvent congregational leadership. We don't need therapeutic counselors anymore. We don't need pastors who are managers in the congregation, but we need missionaries who, together with the congregation, offer meaning and significance and a holistic understanding of salvation. So that was 1997, and that's exactly the same year that a very important volume came out edited by Darrell Guder, entitled The Missional Church. And some Mennonites were involved in that process of getting together that volume. And since 1997, most of our churches, there's broad ecumenical interest in talking about missional church. Since 1997, the tone has not changed. And it's also clear that things don't change overnight in terms of how we do church. At the seminary where I'm teaching at Tyndale, it's Canada's largest seminary. It's an evangelical seminary. I joined the faculty in 2006. Earlier, I think 5 years earlier, they had decided to frame all of their programs in a missional frame. So that means rethinking how you do systematic theology in light of not just the cultural changes, but trying to think God as a missionary God. What does that mean about the way we do systematic theology, teach the Trinity? We have to rethink how we do church history and ask, how have churches in other times and places engaged their cultural context with the good news of the gospel? We have to rethink how we do hermeneutics What would a missional hermeneutic look like? In other words, you all know from your seminary experience or your training in church that we bring a particular set of eyes and experience to the text. Now, if this is our experience and these are our eyes, how are we reading the text differently? And so on, right? So in other words, that would mean a complete rewrite of the curriculum. And AMBS is doing this and others as well. But 10 years in, or almost 10 years in, we're realizing that the old mindset, the old skills, the old practices don't change overnight, and it might take a generation. But we're trying. But the shift is so significant, and the old worldview or approach is so deeply ingrained in us, whether we're Anabaptist or whether we're something else. But we need to begin to rethink, or else, as John Taves said, the church will not survive. It will not survive unless it learns to be missional. So, it's not going to be enough to simply say, okay, we're just going to work harder now. We got to just put more energy into spiritual formation or in trying to reach out to our community. Trying harder is not going to work if we are using or beginning with false assumptions about our context and maybe about the gospel. And it's not going to be enough simply to say, well, we'll just keep on doing what we're doing. We're fine. We don't have to really grapple with these changes. We seem to be doing okay. Maybe for the next year or 2 or 3 or 4. But it's moving forward with blinders on, I think.